Mr. Rainwater,
Yeah.
we have a problem to solve this evening.
All right. What is our problem?
The number one problem every storyteller faces, and I
Hmm.
guarantee every single person who's ever written a story has this problem, had this problem, will have this problem yet again. How to name your characters. Coming up with the monikers of which they will go by for the entirety of your story, your franchise, whatever it may be. This is a
Yeah.
finite decision that cannot be changed whatsoever. Once you've like published, or you know what I'm saying.
Sure.
So we're going to be tackling the problem. Where do you start? How do you work through it? How do you use a process of elimination to kind of dwindle things down to the top contenders, a tournament of names, if you will? And then finally settling on what you're sticking with. Now, in our little shared document where we just type up name or topic ideas that we're going to talk about, I kind of broke it into this where I noticed that a particular action type character has a commonality.
Okay.
So you have your stereotypical, kind of smarter than the average bear action hero who's tough, not necessarily muscled out, steroided up, whatever, but he's tough and he's a little bit smarter. And if he's not a little bit smarter than his antagonist, he gets smarter than the antagonist by the end of it. And every single one of these characters has a name that starts with a J. James Bond, Jack Bauer, John McClane, so on and so forth. So the
Sure.
J thing jumped out at me, and this is kind of how I stumbled onto this topic was, what the fuck does a J have to do with a strong male character?
Well, that's funny because Jake Baker is like the name of my main character.
Right.
In Trailer Park Walk. So when you said that, I was like, ah, shit.
But
The formula works.
It does work, and there's something about that particular sound J, that seems to instinctively reaffirm like a strength. You know what I mean? Like they may not like. I don't know if I would say Jake is anywhere on the line of Jack Bauer. You know what I mean? Like they're
No.
two different characters, but
They're very different.
would you say that the character's strength level, like in terms of their, this is where I think it comes into the resolve of like what they believe they should be doing?
I think I get what you're saying. Because another character I was thinking of because I saw this movie recently was Big Trouble in Little China. Jack Burton.
Yep.
I think it's Burton. He's another character. He's actually one of my favorite action hero characters because he's like, he talks shit, but he actually kind of sucks at being an action hero.
Yeah.
Which creates a lot of comedy, in the movie.
Yep.
And I think, I do something very similar with Jake Baker, where it's like the setup is to think of this character as an action hero, but in execution, they're not that competent at the action part. But they're very like loyal. They're going to be there when, shit hits the fan, regardless, because that's their intent, or kind of going with what you're saying. That's their conviction, basically. And I think that might be like one of the big, maybe that's the overarching theme that you're connecting the dots on with all these J. Go ahead.
That's kind of where I wanted to go. So like when you're brainstorming a story, like you kind of know the genre that you want to work in, whether it's a fantasy comedy or a action horror, the rarity when that actually occurs. The the first thing you have to do is it starts with character. Like you might have a loose story like gimmick in mind, or a plot or something, but you need to have a character, and in terms of taking notes. Unless you're Quentin Tarantino and you just want to call him the Bride, and that's the end of the name shit for a while. You need to come up with some kind of a name to refer to that particular character. So what I've done in the past is I have studied similar films within the same genre and searched amongst the main characters for the commonalities that I might recognize in their names. So, for example, when I was constructing Haunted, which is a horror movie, kind of slasher, kind of like monster movie, somewhere along that line. I watched a bunch of horror movies, and I started noticing that all of the main female leads had gender-neutral type names.
Okay.
So, I guess Lori isn't really a gender-neutral type name, but it kind of feels like one still. I don't know. It's weird that I'm describing it like this, but when I look at something like Scream, the main character's name is Sydney, and Sydney can go either way. It can be a boy or a girl.
Sure.
So when I started approaching towards naming my character, I went with the same mentality. I was like, okay, I need some kind of a unisex name, and what can I do? So I think step 2, and confirm with me or deny if you have ever done this, but you start thinking about the relative age of your character, and then you go to a baby book. You figure out like what year it is now. You figure out how old they are, and then you backtrack to the year that they would have been born, and you look at baby books, and you start looking at like the names, the top names for that year.
Popular.
Have you ever done that?
Yeah. I can't say that I've ever done that, actually. My process is like way more chaotic than that, but please go on.
Well, I did that, and that's where I landed on Taylor for my character's name, because it was a gender-neutral name. It came out in the year around where I wanted her to be born, so that she would be the certain age that I wanted her to be in the time period that the film was set. And last but not least, I know I'm kind of jumping to the end of the podcast almost, but the final factor for me was to look at it and go, there were a couple of other names that were in contention. I couldn't tell you what they are right now, but it just felt right. You know what I'm saying? Like when I saw it, I knew that was the one, even though I picked out a couple of other ones and, I made a list and did all that shit. But that was the one, it was wasting time almost. That was the one that was going to stick, and it has. And there's no other character that I could not see her named anything else. I've tried to mix it up a bit where I've been like, oh, I'll just name her Nikki. And it just doesn't work. Like, it feels wrong. So I'm curious, that's my process at the moment to naming at least my main character. How do you go about the idealism? Is it just a name that pops in your head? Do you do any kind of research in the thing? Because also, you're working in a fantasy type world. So there's, you could use like a fantasy name generator, but you're just going to get names like Grimlock and shit like that are going to pop up. Like, how do you arrive at the name Jake for a fantasy character?
Let me start with one of my other projects. So Bat Monster, there are no named characters in Bat Monster.
Interesting.
None of the characters, like, you never find out any of their names. And when me and Austin made this story, we did so with the intent of, we wanted to figure out what kind of names readers would give them to sort of like, because one of the big parts of that story is going into putting your own interpretation into the events that are going on the page, right? And I'm saying all this to kind of start off as like, let's start from bottom of the barrel. You have a story where you don't even know, right, what the character's name is.
Right.
It's still possible to be involved in that story because you're, especially for film and television, because what then you're associating is something that's more iconographic. Like, you could associate Mickey Mouse without ever having to know Mickey Mouse's name. You just know the three circles, right? So just to start off, we'll say not everything is necessarily in a name, but a name sure as hell helps, right? The name is like the next step up when you're creating a character. So for somebody like Jake, I started with Jake without knowing his last name, and it was mainly because I have a cousin named Jake, and that was like literally it. Like that was just kind of like the character's not really like him at all. It's just like I kind of was thinking like it's a good name for somebody who is Southern or has like a Southern sort of affect. And then Baker came out of just wanting to have something that kind of rhymed or had good like, euphonics. Like it just sounds good together.
It's so interesting that you're raising this point because that's exactly how I went about naming the main character for the Indomitable Spirit. The exact same way. I did not do the process that I just described. Yeah. I picked my best friend's name, which was Steven. Granted, I did. It's a very comic booky thing to have the first and last name kind of have an alliteration or some kind of a rhyme thing to it. Like you got Peter Parker, Bruce Banner. Like you have that kind of there's an alliterate like a phonetic type. You know what I mean? Like there's some kind of a connection.
Stan Lee like cornered that market for a long time, right?
Yeah. And
with some exceptions, right? Because like Tony Stark is one of the few exceptions in his book where it's like, it's not like Bruce Banner or all the other names that he has where it's just like, I think so. There's two ways of going about it, right? Or let's say from this level, there's two ways of going about it. You have like something that sounds good, or you have something where the name kind of evokes a feeling about the character. So like. Great example, and this is also kind of pulling from different Starks. Game of Thrones, right? You have those Starks, or you have a character like Jon Snow. They all evoke notions about like these people and where they're from and how they're feeling on a day-to-day basis and what their lives are like. It's less about how the names sound, and it's more about what the names mean. To go further into sort of, talking about names within Trailer Park Warlock. So something that I am doing is there are two other characters in the series who become Jake's apprentices, and one of them, the boy, is Nate Butcher, and then the girl is Candace Stickmocker. So I ended up like making it into this like butcher baker candlestick maker thing as like that was literally the whole idea. It was just like, okay, their names are going to be centered around this gag.
I love it.
And the idea is like, as you're reading through the story, you slowly pick up on the gag because you're not going to find out their last names immediately, just kind of over time. And then and the idea is you have this moment of like realization of like, oh wait, what? Like
a beautiful
like,
setup and payoff, I might add.
Yeah. So that's another way that you can use names is like as a kind of, especially if you're doing comedy, as like sort of a setup and payoff sort of thing, because you don't usually find out the last names of characters that easily unless you're just like doing exposition at the beginning or something like that, because most people don't usually refer to each other by their full name unless it's like a go ahead, Joe.
I would just tack on there. I would think that you said you don't normally hear the last name. I would correct you on that and say you don't normally hear the full name because so for something like the Indomitable Spirit, that's a martial arts story centered in around a martial arts school. Everyone in there is taught respect. You refer to everyone as Mr., Mrs., and then their last name. So a lot of times people will shorthand things and they'll just call people by their last name and never refer to them by their first name because it's disrespectful. So I think you're correct in that you would never get a full name on every basis because it's just awkward. No one refers to people by their full name, but you would get one half of the name. And
you're totally right.
The other side is a little bit hidden. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of, it depends on, it's absolutely situational dependent about which
Yeah.
way you go.
Yeah.
Because if it's just a group of friends, yeah, there's no reason why. I mean, you can even look at it like that though, because like in American Pie, they refer to him as Stifler. They don't refer to him
Right.
as his first name. It's just Stifler. So I mean, and that's a good way to. This is a little bit of a segue, but putting my business hat on, when you're creating a name, you also want something that's very unique. Simply because A, you don't want people knocking you off or stealing a name, and B, you want your character to kind of pop. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, you want to have a unique type name. So it's interesting that you brought up Game of Thrones, because I was listening this week to George R. Martin speak about how he names his characters. And he said he went back into like history and he was examining names, kind of like the baby book type thing. And he was always like, there's always like a John or an Edward or, a Philip. You know what I mean? But back then, people were very illiterate in the time era that he was kind of looking at, and
Yeah.
they could not spell their own names correctly. So that's how Edward became Eddard, and Brandon
Oh.
became Brennan, and things like that. So he was able to take the era where the characters were situated in and look at commonalities about the era and say, this is how I can alter this name and have it, it's phonetically, no one shakes a stick at Eddard. The name works.
Yeah.
It becomes a fantasy name because it's not a name that we've really ever heard. But it's unique to itself because it's not an ignorant, but an uneducated way of spelling Edward. You know what I mean? Like if someone
Sure.
just didn't have the proper education to know how to spell their own name, that's how it could become that. So it's interesting to see that, but I'm curious to know, is there any things that you do? I mean, the gag is definitely a nice way to put it, especially when you're writing a comedy. You want to have as many jokes as possible. That's the name of the game. So I'm curious to know, is there any approach that you do take or would take to add some kind of unique flavor to a name that's already describing, or you know what I mean, creating that emotional picture of the character just through the name?
That's an interesting question. Yeah. With Trailer Park Warlock, it's pretty straightforward for the most part.
Yeah.
I will say, like, sometimes there are names where, especially if they're based on characters who they're like based on real life people. So I have a couple of characters in the story that are inspired by real life people, and that really determines how I'm going to think about their name, and how I'm going to like make those names pop, basically. Like, so for instance, there's a character named Lenny McKinney, who, first of all, like, very, very Irish kind of sounding name, and he's based on the figure of Terence McKenna. So Terence McKenna was like this shamanologist, psychedelic pioneer, kind of a weird, kooky guy, and a big inspiration for me. But my intention was sort of going into it of like, I want to make this character for other people who are weirdos like me, who would be interested in this dude and can pick it up, pick up the reference. Not make it too obvious, but make it obvious enough that you're like, oh wait, hold on. And then there was another one named Tabitha Lily. That one was one where I just mashed two different ideas together. First of all, Tabitha is just like, it's not a name you hear too often,
Yep.
It's kind of going with what you were talking about with like Eddard, or like some of the Game of Thrones characters' names. There's definitely a lot of like older type names can pop out because we just don't hear them that often, right? Like, so for instance, like I was reading about just like what's the etymology for the name Chad, and apparently there are people named Chadrick at some point in the past,
Okay.
right? And over time, it just like kind of slowly evolved into to Chad. Like apparently, like like Matthew, my name, one of the original soundings of the name would be Modest Yahoo. So like, like things evolve over time, and a lot of that has to do with, translating from one language to another, right? Kind of what you were talking about too, about like when you, like if you're coming from one country to another, and they don't speak your language, and you need to be like recognizable to them by some means or whatever, and
Yeah.
they're not catching on to Modest Yahoo. You're like, okay, Matthew, we're just gonna like
Yep.
condense it.
That's a
and
very
it keeps,
that's a very Ellis Island approach. Where
yes.
yeah, I can't say that. I'm gonna write your name down as Vito Corleone. But it is a good way to look at it, tracing lineages of names and also using a foreign version of a name for something. So oddly enough, if you want to call it a character, I would refer to it more of a persona. But
Yeah.
people call me Jow, which is short for Jow, and I assure you, my two very white Caucasian parents did not name me Jow. They named me Andrew. But the reason that I was named Jow, or I go by Jow most of the time, is because there was a Chinese foreign exchange student who could not pronounce Andrew, or I have never really seriously looked this up, but Jow might be the Chinese version of Andrew. And
Okay.
that stuck with a bunch of my friends, and they called me it, and then it got shorthand. That was another thing. Nicknames become another thing. So that's another
Yeah.
thing that I wanted to talk about, was going into nicknames. That's something that I feel a lot of people credit me when they look at my scripts and screenplays and so forth, about my dialogue. They always talk about how well my dialogue is written. It's very realistic and stuff. And the only thing I've ever been able to pinpoint, because most of the time when I'm writing dialogue, it's just how I feel. I'm like, yeah, that's not working, that's too wordy, that's clunky, yada yada yada. That's all instinctual stuff. The only thing I've ever been able to pinpoint is that people go by, not necessarily go by, but they refer to other people by nicknames more than people notice. So even if you're referring to someone by their last name, they use it as a nickname. Mom and dad, nicknames technically.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, there are people who don't call me Jow. There are people who call me Andy. And I don't think my wife doesn't call me Andrew. I don't think I've ever heard her call me Andrew. I think she only calls me Honey, etc., stuff like that. So
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I go about it, is I always look at how can I nickname this person after I've named them. So I have the given name, and that not only adds more, it gives another opportunity to create characters. So you talked about Game of Thrones, where you've got Jon Snow. So Jon is a very good, strong name. It's one of those J names. And then you've got Snow, which is pure, right? It's like the purest of pure. It's untouched by evil, so on and so forth. So he's going to be the hero. He's the courageous, steadfast, right there. And then there's so many people who call him the bastard. He's Ned Stark's
Right.
bastard, right? Like that's his nickname basically throughout Game of Thrones. So what George R.R. Martin is doing by using that nickname of a bastard on him is making him an underdog. Because otherwise, what's flawed about this character? You know what I mean? Like he's got everything going for him. He's going to be the guy that's going to save the day. Oh, no one believes in him. No one's giving him a chance. No one is supporting him. No one is really standing by him. That's how that name adds dimension to the character. So when I approach my characters, the first thing I do is after I've named them, and like you said, I've kind of started the foundation of who that character is, that persona, the core of who they are through the name. Then I start examining how I'm going to nickname them, and just kind of really get into either a flaw or even if their name is something boring, right? You know what I mean? If it's just a flat name and it's like, okay, I don't want to give him a real name, then the nickname is where it comes in. So you look at something like Digits. I had a character named TS, right? Which was his initials for Terry Scott. What we did was we took his initials and we spun them so that it was a joke about his initials that meant too soon, because he was constantly cracking jokes, about someone who had just died, and it was just too soon. Like, he was that guy who just
Yeah.
went too far all the time.
Right.
And that was a way I added more dimension to that character. So I'm curious, is there any other ways that you add dimension to characters by either like a middle name, or a nickname, or is there like a fantasy name? Like, you know what I mean? Like, so he's a warlock. Jake's a warlock. Is
Yeah.
there
Right.
anything that they refer to him by other than a warlock, or by Jake?
Well, actually, I mean, that's there are he is referred to in different ways by different characters, and like
Yep.
because this is a
Okay.
fantasy story, you have situations where he encounters gods, and other sort of like beyond the pale sort of situations. So like one of the principal villains in the story is Set, the god of discord, and he refers to Jake simply as Chief of Secrets. And people have asked why that is, and the main reason for that is I just like did some research as to like what was the name, like how were magicians referred to basically in Egyptian language. Are people in the priestcraft basically, and that's what I could come up with, was like Chief of Secrets. And I was like, oh, that's got a really interesting ring to it, because it basically means pretty much all the same things that I've been going towards, because a lot of the story deals with concepts of the occult, and the occult just literally means hidden. What's hidden, what's not seen in broad daylight basically. And so I was like, that really works as, it's not really a dig on him. It's just more like Set kind of recognizing him for what he is, basically. And then like the other character, Aris, simply refers to him as Warlock, never referring to his name. And the idea behind that is it just gets under Jake's skin, basically, because it's like he has a fucking first name.
I like that, because this is something else I wanted to talk about, which was how you can use names, or nicknames or whatever, to establish character relationships as well,
Yeah.
by the name that someone refers to someone as. So, like, for example, in the martial arts film that I have, there's a disgraced former martial arts instructor who was bestowed the rank of master, but and in martial arts you refer to someone as Master Rainwater, Master so and so, whatever.
Yeah.
And when a student comes to see him, they refer to him as Mister. And it's not out of disrespect necessarily, but they're out of practice. And it's that kind of a use of that name in that situation where it insults the main character a little bit, but it also kind of establishes the distance between those two characters. And I like how you were talking about, the one character just refers to Jake as Warlock, as if it were a disparaging,
Well, and here's the thing:
insult.
is Warlock is like it was originally in the same way that Witch came up as a disparaging term. So like that's the other part of it, right? Is like I don't like Aris doesn't mean it in that way, but for Jake, like it does kind of sting him, basically.
Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt. Go on.
No. You go right ahead. I was done.
But yeah, I mean, as far as I understood about the etymology of the name Warlock, apparently it meant like something to the effect of somebody who deals with the devil, basically. So like, it's the character of Jake also, like, he has kind of reddish hair. So like that's another aspect of it too when I was designing the character, is to have other things to refer to sort of ancient sort of like medieval English etymology, and to connect those dots, because there's so many negative connotations that we have with like witchcraft and stuff like that, and all that has a history that's connected to all these different names, different words, and basically just kind of in some ways trying to attempt to flip the connotation to some extent, and playing with those words in that way. And that's anyway, to go on, Jow, I was going to ask you, like, I'm trying to remember what you were saying previously in regards to solving our problem about names in the how to figure out a name for a character, right? I tend to stick to like the history stuff, right? I like that for whatever reason. That's where my like attention is. For you, like, is it more about the sound or is it more about the feeling, or does
Uh,
it, or is it really different depending on the character?
it's definitely about the feeling. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that to me is gonna. So like when I was naming um, the antagonist of Haunted, right? It's
Hmm.
this like guy in skeleton get up and all this kind of stuff. What I did was I examined some of the stuff by horror movies, and yes, you have Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, and Jason Voorhees. You have these kind of slasher type characters, but there's a lot more characters who are referred to by not so much a nickname but an ambiguous name. So you have like Ghostface or Pinhead, Leatherface. Um, and I was watching one of these movies that influenced Haunted directly, which is a film called The Funhouse by Toby Hooper. And there's like the first. It's a movie about a carnival, and these kids try to sneak into the funhouse after the carnival is closed down, just to goof around, probably have sex, whatever. And the first person they meet when they get to the carnival is just referred to as the Barker, which is just the guy, shouting out, "Get your tickets here, showing up late." Da da
Yeah.
da. But the guy had such a nice tone to his voice, the cadence in which he spoke, and everything. I knew when I got around to casting, I was going to point to that character for my actor who's going to play the lead antagonist in Haunted, and look and tell him, kind of study how this guy's talking. I like the way he speaks. And so, in order to do that, I had to find out what this character's name was. And I go to the credits, and little do I know, he's just titled The Barker, which can be a very lazy way to go about, paperboy number one, delivery guy number two. You know what I mean? Like, that's a
Yeah.
very easy, writery way just to say, fuck it, whatever. But at the same time, for what I'm doing, the movie's a mystery movie at its core. So I looked at that and I was like, you know what? That name is ambiguous. Like you don't know who this guy really is. If he were arrested, how would they get his name? If he doesn't have a license on him, and this, carnival is like crazy and stuff like that, there's nothing to know who this guy is. So I immediately was like, okay, I need another version of the Barker. You know what I mean? So I looked it up and I was like, oh, a greeter. Kind of like, you go to Walmart and there's a greeter. There's somebody standing at the door just to say hello, and that's it. And that was it. That was the end. That was all she wrote. And was the greeter. That was all that I had to name my lead antagonist. And suddenly I felt like, okay, that's unique. I don't know of any horror icon named the greeter. And all this guy does is he welcomes you. And it's very, it established that whole, he's the lead. He's the first person you meet. He's going to be the guy. He's a Willy Wonka type, an evil Willy Wonka, basically. So, him being the greeter, the first face you see, he's the face of the haunt.
Yeah.
And it resonated. So, that feeling of, I don't know who this guy is. He's the greeter. That's all I can refer to him when I talk to the cops. The greeter. What's this guy's name? I don't know. That kind of creeps me out. Well, we can't
Yeah.
find him. What's his address? Like all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff tied into it. So it became the idea of, okay, it establishes who this character is. It creates a feeling of uncertainty about him. It has ties to other things in this genre that are speaking to me, but not overused in the genre so much that people will be like, oh, another one. And it was also a name that would be unique to that particular character. If I can get the film off the ground fast enough before some other character randomly is named the greeter, that's the Halloween costume. going forward. Business hat back on. It's like, oh, the greeter trademark. Boom. That's my character.
Yeah.
Anytime someone wants to do that, you know what I mean? So like
Yeah.
it fit all of that criteria. And that's really where I came at it. So it was one of those situations where I really had to check off all of the boxes. And if I didn't check off one of them, it didn't work. So I'm curious to know from you when you're going at names, because alternate names in terms of not the main character, your side characters, your antagonist, this and that, do you approach it any differently than you do your main character? Or do you have all the same check mark boxes? Do you know what I mean? Like, do they not have to meet as many? Do they meet different
that's
ones?
an interesting question. Well, like I said earlier, like especially with the more fantastical the characters get, the less like or I should say the less vowels and just letters in general that are involved with their name.
Yeah.
Particularly in my books. But so like Set being a particular example where it's almost like a musician's name, like Prince, where it's just like that's it, right?
Yep.
On the other hand, like another character that I can think of where their name really comes in a lot of different alterations is one of the characters in season 2 was named Jacques Pontou, and he was like this Frenchman who had immigrated to Louisiana and had this whole big backstory, was basically a vampire, but nobody really called him Jacques. Everybody referred to him either as Pontou, or those close to him who spoke English referred to him as Jack, because that's a lot easier than Jacques. I guess. And well, there was another part of it too, is the people who called him Jack because they knew him when they were all pirates together. So like there's history behind it and all this other stuff. So like Jake Baker apprenticed underneath him, and Jake just referred to him simply as Pontou in a very informal. It's weird because I think there's often times where the formality is like the formality of calling somebody by their last name almost has an informal sort of, or I think the way you put it earlier made more sense to me. It's distanced. It's like I don't really refer to you in first name because I'm not that close to you, sort of a mentality,
yep.
Right? And he was definitely a character where nobody was really close to him, so most people just referred to him as Pontou. Pontou, by the way, is just literally French for pointy or sharp. So that was the other part of like coming up with that name for that character. So that's probably my most like interesting example. That was certainly like the one character whose name I played around with the most. Like a lot of characters in that story, a lot of their names are kind of either play on words or have multiple functions outside of just being their name, right? And so for me, it's like that becomes about getting a ton of utility out of words. Like not even thinking about it in the sense of like it being a name, and just think of it in the sense of just like
a story device,
words.
Almost.
Yeah, story device, basically. That's the best way of putting it.
Or even a comedic setup. Like you were talking about, like people, saying the wrong name or this or that. Immediately, my brain goes to Rookie of the Year, the 1993 teen baseball movie or whatever with the little kid who breaks his arm and then he gets the pitch for the Cubs because it heals the wrong way, and the coach cannot pronounce his name correctly. It's Henry Rowengartner, and he just calls him Rosenbagger, Runamucker. Like it's a comedic setup. You know what I mean? So like you look at something, Henry Rowengartner. Okay, that sounds like a normal person's name or whatever. But then the fact that someone can't pronounce that name particularly right adds comedy to the particular thing. But then it's also a utility because at one point when they get to, I think it's the playoffs or the World Series, it's this big dramatic beat where it's like, what do we do? And the coach calls him by the right name. It's like,
Right.
not only has that dramatic beat gotten hit where it's like, hey, this is a moment, but it's also another thing where it establishes that character has, this coach who's like a 40, 50-year-old guy or whatever is now respecting this 12-year-old who's pitching for the Chicago Cubs in the World Series. Like, you know what I mean? It was a utility type thing to kind of
it creates a rite of passage moment, basically.
Yes, and it helps the story along, which I think is something that we definitely need to tie in here, is that when you're picking out the name, it has to tie into the story somehow.
Yeah.
So even when you look at something like Luke Skywalker, everybody knows the original name was Star Killer, and there's such a different connotation that comes with Skywalker versus Star Killer. Star Killer feels like an antagonist. It's there's a murder, there's evil in that name. But Skywalker is adventurous. It's it's positive, it's uplifting, and there's
a lot of uplifting's a great way of putting it. There's a lot of levity to it because it makes you think of lightness and flying basically.
And you even look at Darth Vader, and everybody knows the story about that. The whole it's Dutch for father, right? Isn't it?
Yeah.
Darth Father, like that's technically, and so it's also fun going back to our April Easter podcast to maybe shove some Easter eggs in there, kind of like how you were talking about with Jake and the candlestick butcher, baker, candlestick maker. That's a setup for a joke. You know what I mean? So that's a nice utility to get out of it. But you can also hide things in the names that maybe even if it doesn't tie in for the plot, you know what I'm saying? Like that's sometimes that kind of stuff can get a little cringy. When it's like, like if it was common knowledge that Vader meant father, and then he goes, "I am your father," everybody that already knew that would be like, like that would just be fucking lame.
Now I'd say George Lucas is one of the few who've kind of gotten away with the idea of like making names that really are kind of on the nose with the character. Because another great example is Han Solo, like. How on the nose is that, right? But it works for that character, because that particular combination of sounds make you think less of the solo part. You actually think more of the whole name together, because you usually you either hear Han or you hear Han Solo. And every once in a while you hear the people refer to him as Solo.
Shouting Solo, but you got a giant space slug on screen, so it's kind of a distraction.
Exactly. It's another one of those examples of like if they're referring to him by last name, it's bad news, basically.
Yes, and that'll come into the tone of how the actor's speaking the name and this and that. But it is interesting to hide allegorical things within the name. You know what I mean? Whether it can help the audience deduce themes and symbolism and stuff after the fact, and that can help not necessarily just defending arguments about what a story is about or what a character is representing or whatever, but just to help the audience interpret more. Do you know what I mean? So that they get a better grasp of what's being said by the particular storyteller. There's other ways to do it too, where it's just a fun nod to other things. So, again, I'm a massive Scream fan. Everybody knows this. The writer who was the writer of Scream was a massive Halloween fan. So obviously he had a fandom of a movie that came before it. So you have Dr. Loomis who fights Michael Myers. And Sidney's boyfriend in Scream is named Billy Loomis. Obviously, that is a reference to Halloween because Scream is very meta and this and so forth. The irony is the name Loomis in the original Halloween ties back to Psycho.
Okay.
So you've got this kind of running thing going on through horror classics where they're all kind of borrowing this name, and it's really interesting to see that kind of continue from film to film to film, because it's almost like a good luck charm that's kind of appeared in these horror
Yeah.
classics. And it's interesting that maybe someone will pick up on that and shove that into their script or whatever like that. And yeah, somebody might cringe because the internet these days and everyone talks about all their favorite movies 24/7. But before the internet, you know, if you watched Psycho 12 times, you were considered one. And if you watched Halloween that many times, you were, once again, considered a crazy person. If you watched Scream that many times, you're insane. Nowadays, you can go to Batman Begins 37 times in the theater, and people would just be like, oh, that's Jow. But the point of the matter is, like, that's not so common. But if someone were to pick that up and use that in their names today, do you think that's cheating to carry on that torch because it's so common these days to notice that things like that? Or, like, you know, that nod or that reference to something that's come before? So if I named, you know, somebody, you know, Bond, Jimmy Bond, is that too on the nose obvious? Is that too much of a tie to James Bond? Or can I take that name and continue the legacy of that kind of character?
I would say one of my favorite sci-fi novels, Snow Crash. The main character of that novel, his name is Hero Protagonist. And now, if you see it in text, it's Hiro, Hiro, which is a Japanese name. But still, his name is, I mean, if you just read it aloud.
Yeah, they did that in the, what was that, the TV show? Was it called Heroes?
Oh, yeah,
Save the cheerleader,
That's
save
right.
the world, all that kind of jazz.
Yeah.
The Asian character was named Hero as well, but it was
That's
the
right.
same spelling that you're referring to.
And, you know, that never, I mean, for me, for that particular story, it never affected my enjoyment of the story. I thought it was sort of an unusual choice, but it's also an unusual book. It has a very, it feels like a 90s action movie. It has sort of parts of it that have a sort of an ironic sensibility, some tongue-in-cheek moments while being like really thoughtful and kind of out there. So like it really, that's kind of one of those things that really depends on how the feel of the story. Like another example, Speed Racer. Like the main character's name is literally fucking Speed. Like
Right.
you can only really get away with that for a story like Speed Racer because it's so elevated above normal everyday life that it becomes much easier to accept, you know, a more ridiculous or more, you know, unusual name basically for a main character. And if you're going to give anybody an unusual name, it usually should be the main character at least, right?
Or the antagonist.
That's the person.
Those two are kind of, there's a duality
Yeah.
that goes on there, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly, for sure. And I don't know if that's a response to your original question necessarily.
What was my original question? I don't remember anymore.
That's why I was saying that because I couldn't quite remember what your original question was.
Well,
But
I think we've
Go
kind of
ahead.
cracked the code here. I think, you know, we've kind of examined it from all angles. So
yeah,
I'll bullet point it right now. Number one, this is the number one check mark that you have to get when you're naming your character. It's got to feel right to you as the author. That's the number one requirement. It has to feel right. Number two, it has to work within that character's plight. Like it has to serve towards that character as a what's the opposite of a flaw? A talent, a skill, and or a flaw. It also has to be definable through the relationships of other people, so that you can make story relationships between characters that can resonate just by how or what they refer to the other character. Which brings me into my next checkbox. You have to be able to kind of derive some kind of a nickname from that particular name, just again to service a story through character relationships. And then last but not least, you can also embed some kind of Easter egg, homage, or some kind of a symbolic meaning within it to also add to your character and to your story or your thematic premise. Those would be my check boxes. Rainwater, did I miss any, or is there any others that you would like to add?
Well, I would like to add, because I was doing some reading earlier today, and I thought this was a very interesting little bit of trivia. So, the author Neil Gaiman talks about how he came up with the name Coraline for his book that eventually became a movie. And basically said it was from typing Caroline and it coming out wrong. Larry Niven, the science fiction author, said in an essay that writers should treasure their typing mistakes. Once I typed it, I knew it was somebody's name and I wanted to know what happened to her. I recently discovered it was actually a real name, although it's not been used much in English-speaking countries for a long time. And at the turn of the last century, it was a name for a brand of corset. So, that's an example of a happy accident, right? Names can come from all sorts of different particular ways, and I thought that was a really interesting example of how you can have a complete accident lead to inspiration for a character's name, because clearly from that accident, he was able to derive an entire just character from it. So, yeah, that's all I would tack on to that,
Be artistic in your approach. Allow for flaws and stuff like that to be beneficial towards your process. I like that. I think that's a good way to keep it unique, which is a checkbox that I did forget. Just coming from the marketing, branding side of my brain. But no, I guess that's important to storytelling as well, because if your character is such a mundane name that they get lost in your own story and your reader can't remember who the fuck the name is, that's a problem. So creating something unique that stands out and pops, I think that's an important box to check. Excuse me. All right. We're shorter than we usually are today, but I think we're just that fucking good at naming characters.
We are. That's true. It's 100% true. We got it in the bag.
So I'm going to call it there. That's how you name your characters, folks. Go down that list. You can rewind or listen to the podcast again, but if you have any problems, I don't know, type a comment or something. Email us. We'll try and tackle it, but I think we've helped you enough. Good night.